Chapter 7, War for America. The chapter opens up with a vignette about Abigail Adams, who was hoping that the revolution would give women more rights. Her husband, John Adams, who you may know became second president of the United States, her husband was just not interested in women's rights. Women's rights were not to become an issue for many, many years after the revolution, and it was to be 1919 before women got the right to vote. But so the revolution was primarily for men. Women still had a role to play, which we'll talk about more as we go along, particularly as the semester goes along. John Adams stated that Indians, blacks, poor, and even children were acting more independent of authority. I think he was probably right. But nevertheless, the authors of your book say that they don't think he had any evidence for that. I mean, of course, if John Adams would have lived today, I don't know what he'd think. In today's world where the elementary school children will spit on their teachers, kick their teachers, kick their bus drivers, he would see a lack of respect that he did not see in his day. And again, maybe the revolution had something to do with that. The revolution that weakened authority. Yes?
Do you believe that the government itself has a responsibility for the rearing of the children, or like when you say with John Adams saying that the people are acting independent of the government, really, do you think does that go hand in hand, you think? I mean, I'm trying to...
You're getting this, because I've got to get to a discussion going. I think that primarily the parents have a responsibility for the children, because when the government rears up children, the children become incorrigible. And having taught in the public schools for 5.5 years, way back for you people, in the 1970s, I taught from 1973 to 1978 when I had enough of it and I quit. But right today, at this moment, my oldest daughter is teaching at a elementary school, teaching 6th graders in Athens. And it's her first year, and she's hoping she can survive till the end of the year. She has about 75 more days. Only has 17 pupils. See, I had to manage more than 30 pupils in all my classes. She has only 17 pupils, and they're out of hand. They're out of control. And again, this is the government for you. When Washington took over the education, our education went downhill. And the big problem with education in America today is, and this does not apply to college, that teachers cannot keep order in the class. All right. Hey, I'll tell you something. I didn't get a paddling the 12 years I was in the elementary and high school, but one of my brothers did. He had another one waiting for him when he got home. My other brother, another brother of mine, got a paddling at school. He never told his dad. Or dad. Never told him. He wouldn't think about doing such a thing as that. He had another one waiting for him when he got home. Today, you can hardly get a parent to do that. But I had a student who was a year younger than me just last fall. He told about what he got when he got whipping at school. Today, the parents are willing to sue the teachers. And the result is everything is out of hand. But again, if John Adams, your book, I mean, the authors of your book act like, yeah, it was no big deal. But there was a beginning of rebellion against authority. Now, that might have been as a result of the government rebelling against its authority. I mean, the American people rebelling against their king, transferring to kids and rebelling against their husbands, wives, I mean, kids rebelling against their parents and wives rebelling against their husbands. A move that has gone on today. Now, more than 2,300 years ago, a philosopher in Greece told us that give people too much freedom, and after a while they start demanding the authority clamp down. This man's name was Socrates. And we see this going on in Latin America right now, where that gangs, I mean, this same daughter I told you about was in Latin America recently, gangs control even the politicians. Gangs control the government. And they kill people, they rape the women, they run the show, and the result is lawlessness, the type that will happen here eventually. I remember quoting the teacher who taught right next door to my class. He said, these kids, this was in 1974, these kids will grow up and they will have even worse kids than what they are. Well, that was 1974 she said that. I mean, I know I had a student complain to my boss one time about how I was slamming American education. Folk, every one of you I think knows what I'm saying is true if you've been in public schools recently. So you can slam it off if you want to, go ahead. It's there. All right, anyway, and now, and in some ways the Revolutionary War was a civil war of rebels against loyalists. The rebels being the people against England, the loyalists being people for England. Folks, the British, I'm going to tell you right now, the British lost the war, and I think hopefully every one of you know that, so it's not that I'm telling most of you anything new. The British would have won this war easily if they had trusted and used their own loyalists. Instead, they didn't properly protect the loyalists, many of whom fled to Canada. The British governors whom the king had sent over here to be our governors quickly got on board ships and sailed back to England for their own safety and their own personal protection. There was a war on. In response to the battles of Lexington and Concord, the Second Continental Congress met. The First Continental Congress had met before the war started, but after the shooting started, Second Continental Congress met in 1776. They met in Philadelphia, which was to eventually become the capital of the nation for 10 years. One thing they did was they raised an army. Now they had to do two things. This Congress had to, on the one hand, they were trying to make peace with Great Britain to avert a war. I mean, war is risky business. And they knew that going to war against the most powerful country on earth was extremely risky. But they had to raise an army on the one hand and fight Britain on the other one hand and try to make peace with Britain on the other hand. Well, they raised an army and they appointed George Washington as the head of the army. So George Washington, who was at the convention, got on his white horse and galloped off to Massachusetts to take command of the army. And while he was on his way there, the Battle of Bunker Hill occurred. In the meantime, they drafted, but by raising an army, they were telling the king, this thing that went on in Boston is not just a local event, this is a 13-colony-wide event. Now, Canada failed to join us. The West Indies, by the way, now this is something that you won't read in your book, but the West Indies sent a delegation to the Continental Congress, but they were afraid because they said, unlike you, we have no place to run to, we have no place to hide. You know, the West Indies, that's the island of Jamaica, was the biggest of the British holdings in the West Indies. They said, we have the Cayman Islands also, and the Cayman Islands are really small. There was no place to run and no place to hide if the British Army came in. So the West Indies did not join. Canada refused to join. Then years later, when Canada wanted to become independent and they asked for our help, we said, "We're on you. You didn't help us. We're not going to help you." But anyway, Canada never did get the complete break from Great Britain. But anyway, yes.
What page are we on?
What page are we on? It's the very beginning of chapter 7. Thank you. Thank you. Very beginning of chapter 7. I'm going by some notes I have, which are taken from the book, by the way. Yes.
I called and I said I needed to take the test first.
Okay. Bear with me, folks, for a second. Oh, and this is... Please do not write on this book.
Oh,
Don't put your name on it. All right. Yes?
Are we gonna have any questions from today's lecture on this?
No?
No, okay.
Okay, hopefully. In one word, no. All right. All right, anyway. Again, folks, that's on the syllabus. Now, if I happen to ask any question that I did not go over in class or that is not in the book, I promise you I'll throw it out. Give everybody credit for it. Occasionally, now on occasion I have accidentally done that, but anyway, leaving that for the moment. Now, the next thing that the Congress did was they wrote up the Declaration of Independence. A copy of the Declaration of Independence used to be at this school in the Student Center. I don't know if it's still there or not. I haven't seen it in years, but they used to have it. And again, don't do, if you're writing, don't do as Thomas Jefferson did. I mean, he wrote it on July 1776. Actually, they asked John Adams to write it because John Adams was more or less the president presiding over the convention. But John Adams wanted to make sure he was a New Englander. He wanted to make sure that everybody got involved from every colony. So he asked a Virginian man to write it. So he turned to Thomas Jefferson, one of the most educated men in the room, and said, "You write it." So Thomas Jefferson went to an adjacent room, got a feather, dipped the feather in some ink, as they did in those days, and with his quill pen wrote the Declaration of Independence. And copies of it still exist. Actually, he wrote. They made some originals, and about several originals still survive. They've taken the originals and put them inside a container where they pumped out all the oxygen so they won't oxidize. But now, don't do this in your writing. Most of the paragraphs are one-sentence paragraphs, which is frowned on today's writing, unless it's a direct quotation of something. Most of the paragraphs, and almost every paragraph began with "he has," "he has," "he has," "he has," over and over again. Don't begin 2 consecutive paragraphs with the same words, folk. Maybe you're taught this in English class, but with few exceptions, you don't begin a paragraph the same way. He has. The whole thing about that, it was laying all the blame for all the problems on King George III. And to a large extent, I mean, in Great Britain today, the British people still blame the problems on poor old King George III. Prince Charles, who's a great, 5 greats, the grandson of George III, said if the colonialists would have known him, they'd have liked him. He's pictured in the Declaration as a tyrant. In actuality, he was a very shy, retiring man, very unsure of himself. But he came across the colonials as a tyrant. But anyway, the Declaration told of all the grievances they had on George III. Now, something that someone pointed out to me years ago, we're taught that taxation was the #1 issue. Actually, if you look at the Declaration, taxation is like something like number 19 on the list, pretty far down, but it's for imposing taxes on us without our consent. Like that wasn't even all that important. They knew they were going to have to pay taxes anyway. But nevertheless, we're taught that it was taxation. I think a lot of it was the British trying to get us to not use paper money and instead use gold and silver currency like they did. And paper money is what made us feel rich, whether we are or not. But paper money was used almost from the beginning, owing to the fact that gold and silver coins were so scarce.
I think when people talk about the taxation portion of it, from what I remember learning about it, they were talking, that was just one of the things that everybody can actually unify with, because remember, everyone didn't have the paper money or didn't care to use it. They were more on a bartering system. But then now you talk about the British talking about, look, we're gonna micromanage everything. So there was more of the micromanaging. So, but when people think of it, so how do you say it? The taxation. So you see how you lump it all together.
Yeah.
So that's what
But a lot of it too had to do with taking our people and
Right.
trying them over in England for crimes that committed against the British Crown.
Right.
I mean, hey, they had a right to try some of these people, a real right, but the colonials were like, hey, they're Americans, they're colonials, they should be tried here among
Right.
us. And but also quartering of troops. a British officer knock on your door and say, keep these 2 men in your home.
Right.
All that stuff had a whole lot to do with it, and they were expected to keep these Britishers happy and keep them in their homes without the consent of the owner. All that had a whole lot to do with it. But lists a whole bunch of grievances against the king. Now later we're going to talk about the Olive Branch petition that came later, where that they blamed Parliament. So not all the blame should have gone to the king. Parliament had a lot to do with it. Now, the Congress had almost no money and no legal way to tax. The Congress was an unofficial body, so to finance the war, they started issuing paper money. This was the beginning of the issuance of paper money. Well, it actually was not, but the paper money had been in circulation for a long time. Almost every bank would issue its own currency and every colony would issue its own money. So they issued paper money, but they didn't have gold and silver to back up the paper, so the paper money became almost worthless. And also a lot of colonials would not accept paper money, which meant that George Washington and his troops wound up doing without a whole lot of meals. And in some cases outright starving to death because people would not take the colonial money. It became a saying among the colonies, this is not worth a continental. Continentals were what they called the almost worthless paper. Now, I mentioned that paper money was supposed to have gold to back it up. We're going to study later. This wound up being undone by President Richard Nixon many, many years later. Until today, your paper money is just that, a piece of paper. There is gold in Fort Knox, but the gold does not back up your money. And we have all agreed among ourselves to accept this as a means of exchange. In fact, paper is hardly even used anymore. Most of the time anymore, money is get out your debit card or get out your credit card. And that's where you transact, but it's all done by electronic, by computer. I get paid by computer. I get my Social Security check. I mean, yeah, I don't mind telling you I'm old enough to draw. I'll be 70 on my next birthday. I don't care who knows it, which occurs in June. I'll turn 70. But anyway, yeah, but I get my Social Security money by electronic means. It's transferred to my credit union. I got a paycheck from this college 2 days ago. Again, transferred electronically. All right, leaving that. But anyway, but at one time money was gold and silver only. Then it became paper. And the United States led the way in teaching the world that paper money is essential. And I've got to say this on the subject, because it's very important. I spent 27 years at Lockheed. Lockheed could never have paid its workers in gold and silver coins. Just been utterly ridiculous. Especially since Lockheed, one time when I was there, went 6 months without selling an airplane. Now, if you can imagine workers coming to work every day for 6 months without drawing a paycheck, then all of a sudden Lockheed sold 5 planes at once. And everybody then would get paid. I'm speaking unreal now. Everybody would get paid because we just sold our airplanes, and they all get wheelbarrows out to carry these gold and silver coins home. Then there would be thieves all along the way trying to, the whole bunch would have to leave at once and head for the bank and deposit gold. I mean, I'm talking ridiculous. But Lockheed, again, was able to pay its workers every Friday because of the banks. And every bank in the area would take a Lockheed check. All right. Again, again, I'm jumping ahead in the story a little bit, but this stuff I'm talking about money, but the money business is important. And had we not broken away from England, England would never have allowed us to become the country that we become. Simply wouldn't have. Now, for the British, the war was costly because what happened to us many years later, we tried to fight a war in Vietnam, 10,000 miles away. Of course, we had jet aircraft, we had radio, we had telephone. The British were fighting a war 4,000 miles away without the benefit of jet aircraft or even diesel engines, nothing but sailboats, no radios, no telephones, very difficult. So the generals on the field were left to their own devices, largely. Well, after the Battle of Bunker Hill, General Gage Oh, yes. Yeah, General Gage was replaced by General Howe. I used to teach my 10-year-old student here that General Howe had a problem. He just didn't know how. General Howe gets more than his share of blame for losing the war for the British. General Howe, he had a general beside him named General Clinton, his right-hand man, the next in command. General Clinton urged General Howe to, hey, pursue the fleet, because the colonists ran from the Battle of Bunker Hill after they ran out of ammunition. Now, for twice they drove the British back. But the third time they were out of ammo, so they ran. General Clinton urged General Howe, pursue them. General Howe went back to Boston. I mean, folks, there's military risk in pursuing an enemy. At least 2 times in the Bible, there's an instance where the Jews would make as if they were beaten and pull back and lure the enemy into an ambush. And they're known for doing that. And General Howe might have thought, well, hey, but this is a trap. They're not really retreating. Once we've left the safety of Boston, they'll hit us from all sides. Whatever his thinking was, your book says, though, that the colonists were not prepared to fight after they ran out of ammunition. And General Howe could have ended the war, his first big mistake. He did not pursue the fleeing colonials. He could have ended the war right there after the second battle. He didn't. So the war dragged on. George Washington arrived, and he found the colonial army in a very bad state of discipline. Now, folk, I was in the army once, and I can tell you something. I mean, today's generals would never tolerate this either. Some of the officers were serving as barbers and shaving some of their enlisted men, the men under them. This is a no-no in the army. Officers and men have to maintain separate quarters, separate existences. So, but he found all kinds of violations of discipline, and he had wanted to be an officer, George Washington, wanted to be an officer in the British Army, but he never got to be one. But he said, hey, no, we can have none of this going on. Officers would also set up shops and sell goods, sell food and snacks or whatever to the enlisted men. Again, folk in the army, that is a no-no. Some of you might know what I'm talking about. Some of you might not. Well, now the Continental Congress, while George Washington was taking command, the Continental Congress sent the king the olive branch petition, in which they were hoping that if they could now get the king on their side. Now, already the Declaration of Independence had blamed the king entirely, but the olive branch petition left the king out of the blame and laid the blame on Parliament and on the governors that the Parliament had sent over, or the king had sent over, and on the judges the king had sent over. And basically it was an olive branch. The olive branch is a universal symbol for peace. Goes all the way back to the flood story when a dove had carried an olive branch in his beak when he came back the ark and let Noah and the other people on the ark know that plant life was growing again. And the olive branch is a symbol, the dove with the olive branch has become the symbol of peace for the United Nations even. The flood story, by the way, folk, is universal. Every tribe and every nation on earth has a flood story. It's not just one group of people made it up. I mean, it's universal. So anyway, the olive branch was, we're willing to make peace with you, with the country. The king rejected the olive branch petition, and at this point, the war was on. A man arrived from England, well, about a year before, he'd been in America less than a year, named Thomas Paine. And folk, just believe it or not, just yesterday morning I was reading about Thomas Paine. I've read about him several times, but in England he'd been unsuccessful at everything he'd done. He tried, among other things, teaching school. He had tried his father's profession and failed at everything he'd done. He tried being a storekeeper one time. But he arrived from England at this time, and he wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense. You'll notice I wrote that in cursive because when you're writing, titles of pamphlets like this should be written in italics. Anyway, he wrote a pamphlet in which he made the remark that who's to say that just because a man's father was a good king that the son will be king? You know, picking on George III, because George III, his father never got to be king, but his grandfather had been a fairly capable king. But George III was known to be mentally slow. And he said, just because a man's father was a king, what makes you think that the son can be king after him? So, then again, quite a bit of logic. He said that the leaders should be appointed by a vote of the people, and elections should happen often. And at this time in history, a lot of colonials were having elections every year. I don't know how they managed that with the slow transportation and slow communications they had, but they were holding elections every year to see to it that the government changed hands often. All right. Not everyone was willing to declare independence, but some people were. Now, the Declaration of Independence has a date on the top of it, and that is why we celebrate the 4th of July. And I always want to make sure that my 10-year-old students, when I taught them for 5 years, I want to make sure they knew whatever else. Why do we Americans celebrate the 4th of July? The reason is the Declaration of Independence has that date on it. In Congress, July 4th, 1776. Now, actually, the Declaration of Independence was written on July 2nd. It was debated and formally adopted on July 4th with only a few changes. Some people toned down Jefferson's somewhat strong wording. Jefferson was disappointing, but this is democracy. You can write a document, write up a law, and by the time that law gets through Congress, nothing that you wanted can get through. This can happen. I mean, by the time those 535 senators, representatives get through changing it, you can't get it through the way you wanted it. Well, anyway, but it had now, actually, the date it was officially ratified by a vote of the committee and signed was August 2nd. And my dad used to say that we should, what's that?
You said August or July?
I said August 2nd. Actually, it was written by Thomas Jefferson on July 2nd. But he put the date July 4th. Because again, he put the date on it, July 4th, 1776, and that's why we celebrate the 4th of July. But it was actually ratified on August 2nd, August. And it was signed on August 2nd. Now, of the signatories, some of them are famous. George Washington did not sign, he was not there. He was up commanding the army up in Boston. So, but the most famous signature of all